Good afternoon, and welcome to the session From Here to There, the evolution of mobility. It's kind of relevant because we are where we are. We're in Detroit, and we're in some, as most folks say, interesting times. Just very quickly, I'd like to introduce the panel that we have today, and then give you a sense of how we're going to run the session. We've got about an hour, just less than an hour, and we'll have a little bit of an introduction from each of the panelists to give their perspective on the future of mobility and how they see that panning out. Just a couple of minutes on that. And then we'll actually talk through some of the things that may accelerate that, some of the things that may get in the way of actually reaching that vision. And then we'll talk about some of the winners and losers that may be in that future vision. And then we'll come back and open it up to the audience. So between now and then, please be thinking of some of the questions that you'd like to ask. Again, diverse set of panelists that we have. So to my left, we have Jay Barron, the CEO and president of the Center for Automotive Research, followed by Vivek Kundra, who's responsible for emerging markets within Salesforce.com. We then have Michael Littlejohn, who's VP and partner from IBM Smarter Cities. Then we have Venkatesh Prasad from Ford Motor Company, I think responsible for open innovation, a senior leader within open innovation within Ford Advanced Research. And then we have Susan Zielinski from the University of Michigan, who's responsible for smart or sustainable mobility and accessibility research transformation. Easy for me to say. So great. With that, let me just set a little bit of context, if I may. How do we look at the session is titled From Here to There, and what does here look like? Because I'm going to let the panelists take the softball, which is what there looks like, really, and define that. But what does here look like? And I would characterize it in again quite succinctly in 3 or 4 words. Actually, it's quite congested, right? We've got 1 billion cars or vehicles on the road today, right? Come the next 30, 40 years, that will at least double. So we'll go to something like 2 to 4 billion vehicles on the road come 2050. So again, it's congested, being number one. Number two, it's complex. I don't know if you bought a car recently, but if you buy a car in the US, you can choose from about 280 different models. Fuel types, you've got a couple of fuel types typically on the market today. One of them is gasoline, one of them is diesel. In the future, it's going to be multiple, right? So again, it's complex from a vehicle standpoint. It's also complex from an infrastructure side of things. I don't know how many cities look exactly the same in the world, but I bet that there's not very many. Again, it's highly complex from not only the types of things that we have on the road, but the roads that they run on and the cities within which they run. And thirdly, it's costly. To give you a sense, right, it's costly from an emissions standpoint, right? At the moment, we tend to cough out significant amounts of carbon and carbon dioxide, which is obviously concerning us and concerning the regulators. And then two, from an economic standpoint, on the transportation of human beings and goods, in 2010, we spent about $8.25 trillion on the planet. So again, the third descriptor would be costly. So it would be congested, it would be complex, and it would be costly. And the fourth attribute would be convenient, I would say. If we look at transportation, it's relatively convenient, right? Getting from an office downtown Detroit to here literally took me about 3 minutes. Again, it was very, very convenient. So that's my perspective of where we are today. Again, relatively succinct, not necessarily comprehensive, but let's move to the future. What do you think of the future, Jay, and what the future of mobility will look like?
Well, first of all, I think what's interesting is we do have this convergence of the electronics into the automobile, which is an interesting dynamic of itself. These two different fields sort of operate on different wavelengths with a different phase, so they're not really in sync together. Software, electronics is outdated much faster than the cars wear out, and so that's a challenge for the auto companies. Interesting, I had to update the software on my radio and basically reboot it. And first of all, you have to leave the car running. It takes 45 minutes. You have to sit there, and the manual says when the radio says it's done, it's not really done. You still have to do some more things. It's a very cumbersome convergence right now, and I think the auto companies will work through these details and try to get these things back into phase. One of the technologies clearly that's here today that is an enabler going forward to this mobility that we're talking about, of course, is autonomous vehicles. And the technologies, by and large, are available today. They're not maybe available for mass market, but they are available, and we have prototypes, and we can make cars drive themselves. I think it'll be a real milestone the day that we can actually have a consumer sit in a car and literally take their hands off the wheel and let the car go down the road on a public highway. That's a little ways away. And I think going forward, even though the technologies are here and there are issues around how we deploy those, what really has to be wrestled with is what are the policy implications and what is the business case? Because these two are going to have to go hand in hand in terms of motivating these technologies. Clearly, the two biggest motivators for this type of technology have to do with traffic mitigation, fuel economy, and safety. And with traffic mitigation, we are trying to reduce our dependency on more highways, very expensive cost to maintain highways. We don't want to build more highways. We have traffic congestion. In some cases, we can't get more traffic onto the highways. $1.25 million simply to resurface 1 mile of highway. And how many highways do we have to resurface? So it's very expensive. And then on the safety side, we have the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that's saying our goal is 0 fatalities due to crash. Well, 0 is really a big hurdle. And today we have, so it's 40, 50,000 deaths a year due to crash. But if you have a car that can drive itself, that means the car can also knows not to crash. And if the car knows not to crash, maybe 0 is not such a far-fetched objective. The other thing in the field that I actually work closely in is the structure of the car and the crashworthiness and the materials going in the car. We are expending hundreds of dollars per vehicle to make these cars lighter and safer to get better fuel economy. Well, if you do make these cars so that they can drive themselves, you don't need 10 airbags. You don't need crash structures under the car. You don't need a lot of things. So there's money there that could perhaps be transferred over to electronics or sensors so that these cars can eventually drive themselves. So there's a lot of motivation for this autonomous vehicle technology. It's clearly going to have to be motivated initially from the government. If we simply wait for the market to take care of itself, it's going to take a lot longer than really waiting for the market to pull this technology out. So I think there's a significant role for the policymakers that have to help motivate some of the development of these technologies. One final comment, I think, is on the legal side. We talked about looking at a car or technology that takes control of your car. That's a very scary thing. And in a litigious society like we have here, it's often been bantered about, you could have a technology that saves 9 lives, but once in a while it makes a mistake. But 99% of the time it's effective. Well, that 1% of the time is enough to put a company out of business. So we have to weigh the value to society as opposed to looking at our legal system and what it might do to a company who's trying to innovate on some of these new technologies. So autonomous vehicles are coming, and it'll be interesting to see how some of these issues play out.
Okay, great. Thank you. Vivek?
So I think when you look at the industry itself, I think the whole industry, the whole ecosystem is going through a massive transformation. So first, I think you see this transformation, whether it's happening in cities or around the country, in terms of the intelligent transportation infrastructure. We're seeing bleeding of the digital and the physical worlds from investments that are being made, whether it's in smart grid, investments that are being made in terms of sensors. We're already seeing data being mined on a real-time basis, and cities around the world that are democratizing all this data around traffic patterns that are enabling cars to be more intelligently routed, that are enabling people to make better decisions, that are creating a level of transparency that had never existed before. And you're going to continue to see innovation at that level. So one would be around this platform. And government obviously has a huge role in that in terms of enabling it, whether it's through how it spends money on that infrastructure. So if you just think about the pace of innovation when it comes to roads versus tires, roads and the materials that are used to build roads, in the last 30 years, you really haven't seen a lot of innovation. But you've seen massive innovation when it comes to car tires. So that's one area I think in the coming years you're going to see a fundamental shift in not only in material science, but also in terms of how those investments are made. How do you actually invest up front so you can get real-time data, analytics, and fundamentally rethink how a city is engineered.
Okay.
Second area, I think, is going to be around the cars themselves. So you're looking at this entire social revolution with about 1 billion people on Facebook, over 200 million people on Twitter. The question is, why can't your car be social? So Toyota had come to Salesforce.com to Mark Benioff and talked about the future of technology when it comes to cars themselves. And they're putting out a car called Toyota Friend, which literally addresses the issue of, well, why isn't it that your car can't tell your dealer that it needs its oil changed? Or why can't your car, as it's driving, aware of its context, tell you that there's a special Groupon deal available on this block? Why can't your car tell you, your friends are all meeting in a certain place, and why don't we all get together and meet in that same place? So I think you're going to see these social technologies fundamentally change the way cars are actually engineered themselves, beyond the autonomous vehicles. Mm-hmm. And then I think third area is going to be a business model disruption. For too long, what you've seen is that the relationship between a buyer and the car is managed by a dealer. I think that in the coming years, that's going to be disrupted. Car companies are going to be able to have much better insight in terms of what their customers want on a real-time basis, because they can actually manage that relationship with their customers and drive those innovations. Right now, all that is being driven through a third party. Mm-hmm. And from a policy perspective, obviously, a whole host of issues are going to be raised, whether it's around safety, as you mentioned, or whether it's around the legal framework. You're seeing states like Arizona and California passing laws enabling autonomous vehicles. Mm-hmm. And I think you're going to see that across the country and the world.
Good. Thank you, Vivek. Michael?
Russell, the way IBM has looked at it, we focused on the concept of urban mobility because we think that's where the issues tend to be the greatest. And Vivek used the term ecosystem, which I use as well. And the way we view urban mobility and the way we think that effectiveness is shown in urban mobility is by managing a complex ecosystem that's made up of vehicles, it's made up of travelers, it's made up of passages, roads, it's made up of public transportation option, even bikes, okay? And it's made up of parking and parking availability, because that's a key part of the ecosystem. And so the way that ecosystem is managed is that data has to be captured, data has to be integrated, and then intelligence needs to be applied in order to affect the greatest transportation, the greatest movement through these urban areas. And so let me give you an example of something that happened to me recently of how it is today and how it will be tomorrow. I live in a suburb about 15 miles, 18 miles north of Midtown Manhattan. And a few weeks ago, my wife and I were we had tickets to a play on a Friday, a summer evening on a Friday. And we were going in early for dinner. Now, we were faced with 3 options to get there. We could drive door to door, okay? We could take public transportation door to door, okay? Or we could take a hybrid approach. Drive part of the way, park, and then take public transportation to our destination. The challenge, the good news and bad news, the good news is that there are probably dozens of pieces of information out there. Everything from Google Maps to transit sites. The downside is it was unwieldy, and I ended up having just to rely on my instinct, being a 30-year, 40-year resident of New York City or the suburbs. And I don't know we were on time. I don't know if I guessed wrong. In fact, we took the hybrid approach. If you know New York, we drove down to 86th Street, we parked, and then we hopped on I think it was the 2 train down to Times Square and had dinner and the play. In the future, though, what people want is that they want to be able to do that automatically. They want the system to understand where are you starting from, where are you going from, and then have that application go out and pull out everything that's relevant. And oh, by the way, allow you to set your preferences. Because if my preference is to get there as quickly as possible, the options may be different than if my preference is to get there as green as possible or as cheaply as possible. Okay? So this concept of urban mobility is all about managing this complex ecosystem, pulling the data, and then adding intelligence to it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Prasad?
Well, let me sort of start off with a couple of macroeconomic and perhaps historical perspectives. As human beings, we've been around on the planet for 150 million years or so, and so it's been the evolution of mobility from that day on. And we were moving before that, but just not as human beings. And today we are at a point where we have 5 billion plus people moving. Almost everyone moves, whether they need perambulation and help or not, but they are moving. And when it comes to specifically personal mobility and motorized personal mobility, we have in terms of licensed cars, trucks, and buses about 1 billion, as you pointed out, Russell, and that number is just increasing. And what's really fascinating is with the linear increase, you could argue perhaps faster than linear increase in the number of vehicles, there's an exponential increase in the number of interactions that vehicles are having with just about everything. Whether it's entities within the vehicle, the Bluetooth phone in your car, or whether it's speaking to a traffic light near you. And so that's, I think, where the real value proposition is. And as you look out into the future, I really see this coming together of motorized and non-motorized mechanisms of mobility. And I don't think we should trivialize the role of non-motorized forms of mobility. These are pedestrians walking, bicyclists. That still is going to be a significant part of who we are and how mobility is going to be managed out in the future. And so I think it's really the dynamics of value propositions for the multitude of services that would be potentially offered at the right value positioning, whether it's through a coupon positioning service or whether it's parking, that's really going to determine the decisions and the sort of participation that you're going to find across the globe. So it's really, I think it behooves us to take a view that's not centered necessarily in Detroit, but looking at what Detroit offers as an immense power of knowledge and wealth in terms of its manufacturing history, its manufacturing depth that we still have here, and take that and translate that to sort of connecting these gears to just about everything else that the world does need and will be needing going out into the future.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Susan?
This is just so wonderful. I feel like what I was about to say was a sort of a composite of all these different things, and you said some things that I'd never heard of before, so I'm really excited about this panel and how we can connect the dots. So I guess what I'm going to do then is a bit of a summary of some of the things that you've been saying. So I had in mind more options, more connected options. And something that might be different from now is that they're focused on the user from door to door. So rather than focus on the infrastructure, the mode. And so the dots are connected, and the modes and the services and the technologies and the infrastructures are all connected. So it would be sort of like, you know how Thomas Friedman says the world is flat? I think it's like transportation is flat. And as you said, Prasad, there's more of an equality amongst modes. Then some of this might be wishful, but I'm going to say it and put it out to the universe. Cleaner, greener, safer, healthier, lighter, more equitable, more lucrative, more nimble, more tech-supported, and in terms of the integrated wayfinding and the fare payment and the traffic management. And first and foremost, hipper and sexier. It's no longer the big, heavy machine thing. It's this really cool, forward-thinking, interchangeable ecosystem. And I think I heard about it's going to be about moving goods as well as moving people, but I think it's also going to be about moving less. So we don't actually have to move if we don't want to. So we can design cities so we can take shorter trips. We can have local production and distribution, urban farming, which is really happening here, and also tele-everything, telework, teleshop, telecommerce, telemedicine, tele-education. It's also one thing, I think I heard hints of it, I think it's the foundation of one of the biggest emerging industries akin to Silicon Valley. And the industry cluster is beyond manufacturing and embraces the information technologies, but also the real estate, the tourism, the finance and economics, and also the small IT and the small services and the fractional uses that you can use anytime you want. So there's going to be a very exciting new industry opportunity globally, and then some regional cluster development opportunities from an economic point of view. And finally, I think it's going to be regionally customized, which is nice. I see it being less of a cookie cutter kind of a thing, and much more that what we do is we map out and we listen to what the needs are of our own communities. And we have these different options as menu items that we can combine in the best way to meet our communities and our region's needs from both the human livability point of view and the economic point of view. And that's all I have to say.
Wonderful, thank you. So there you have it. That's the future of mobility, I guess, in 5 short bites. But interestingly, right, one question that comes to mind if we think about the drivers of those futures, right, and future visions, I think there is a future vision, and you've all painted kind of versions as we move towards that. Trying to understand what are some of the drivers, right? Traditionally, if we think about an industry, if we think about something growing, we think about macroeconomics, we think about regulation, we think about technology, and we also think about demand. Traditionally in the auto industry, which is, right, I think as was highlighted from Prasad, you know, we're 100, 120, 130 years old in essence, right, in the motorized version of the auto industry that we know. The biggest driver of innovation to date, we could argue the point, but typically in the auto industry is regulation. Whether it's fuel economy, whether it's safety, if we look back over the last 30 years, that content has been driven primarily by regulation. The futures that you defined, what do you see as some of the primary drivers? Again, is it macro, is it technology, is it regulation, or is it consumer pull? Susan, go ahead.
I see all of the above are drivers, and that's what I like about it, because we have the opportunity to use those drivers and not just fear them. But I think one of my favorite drivers is global urbanization, because it changes the paradigm. It says, oh, okay, well, wait a minute now. We used to be able to actually think that as long as every car has alternative fuels and you know, has light materials and all the right things, we'll be okay. But I think the urbanization shift has happened. Remember back in 2007, that big exhibit about we've just crossed 50% of the world is living in cities, and soon it'll be 80. And so then you start to think about Beijing's 9-day traffic jams, and you start to think if everyone in Beijing or India that's still walking and bicycling were in a car, even if it was like the cleanest car on the planet. It's really not conceivable, and their cars would become offices and houses and would take up just too much space. So I think actually for city leaders, for people who have to manage the complexity of not just transportation but the whole caboodle, urbanization has been a really great driver.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Obviously, I think we've talked about this before. The whole generation of wires. There's going to be. I agree with what you said, Susan, because it's going to be all of the above. But it's looking at different things. And you know, you've heard the stories, but I've seen it firsthand with my own kids, where you could take away the keys of the car, but for heaven forbid, don't take away that cell phone. The interests today are different than the interests when I grew up. We used to like to drive cars. Does anybody here remember Fahrvergnügen, the fun of driving? It's becoming obsolete. So I think there will be a demand from society, from kids, from the new generation, who are looking at transportation much differently than we used to as younger people. And then obviously a number of other things that I mentioned earlier about traffic. I think there's a role for policy for the government, public interest, in terms of safety and other things that, if left to the free market, will move too slow. And so they will motivate certain things that are healthy for, you know, a lot of us wouldn't spend more money today to get a greener car. Some of us would, some of us would not. In fact, more of us would not. And so you need the government to sort of step in on some of those things that are important for all of society and longer term. So there will be a role for the market, a role for the government, a role for the auto companies. Auto companies still have to make money. They got to keep on making money during all of these transitions at the same time. So A lot of very dynamic forces, I think, will play out.
Anybody else? Okay, let's move. So,
Can I just throw one little, I know I've been talking too much, but culture. I just think this social networking and fractional use and sort of systems approach and seeing portfolios, and it touches on, you know, the connectivity, your kids and the digital stuff, but I think there's a kind of a social shift that came out of the digital revolution that can't be underestimated. I think it really changes the way we want to do stuff.
If I could just add
please.
to what I just heard and what Sue just said, I think if I had to pick one, I'd just say it's the consumer. It's the consumer that ultimately drives innovation. If no one buys a car, we're out of business. No matter how much we get regulated or not get regulated, we're not here. So what we're seeing is an evolution of new ways by which consumers are going to influence and shape both product definition in its sort of metal bent sense, but also the experience of mobility and what it means to go taking multiple choices of modes of transportation and get from A to B and come back home, as Henry Ford said, you know, safely. So our goal is, at the end of the day, to ensure that we bring everyone back home safely. But how we do this and how the chisel begins to work on shaping this future is going to be intimately determined by the consumer. And the consumer is immensely powerful. Every time someone touches an application on a smartphone, they are trying to say something, and the back end better listen to it. That's the chisel of today, right? And shaping the future of what we're going to offer.
Wonderful. Maybe Vivek and Michael, we could push on one of the other drivers. Again, I bucketed them as macroeconomics, as regulation, technology, and consumer pull. If we think of technology, and if we think of some of the waves of technology, whether it's in the vehicle, whether it's the connection of the vehicle, whether it's the city, and how the technology evolves in the city, how is that as a driver, and what's the relevance?
Well, I think, you know, as Susan mentioned, in terms of the social aspects of it, one of the things that's happening is I notice a lot of people who are buying cars now, what they're doing is they're asking really basic questions, you know, given their experience with their iPad or their experience of going on OpenTable and making a reservation to their favorite restaurant, or, you know, going to Expedia and booking an airline flight. They're asking, you know, why is it that when I walk into a car, like that experience is so alien? It's almost like you take them back a decade in time. And I think the winners in terms of innovation are going to be car companies that close the technology gap between what's happening in the consumer internet and what's actually happening in the car, and the ability to do so obviously in a very safe way. So, you know, artificial intelligence becomes really important. Voice recognition becomes really important. So technologies we're just beginning to see become mainstream now are going to be part of the car, sort of hardwired. So that fluidity, you know, that you feel as a consumer, you know, whether you're on your iPad or you're behind your PC or you're, you know, using a mobile device, that hasn't happened yet. And I go back to something I said about the relationship between the car companies and the consumers. It doesn't really exist. I can't tell you, you know, the number of cars, you know, that I've gone throughout my life. I never really ended up having loyalty to the car company or the brand. And the reason was because there was no relationship. It ended up being through a dealer. And I think in the same way you saw a company like Apple disrupt the music industry, I think you're going to see that happen to dealers, where you're going to see this massive disruption of the dealer ecosystem.
Okay.
You're already seeing a problem with the dealerships who no longer have many cars to fix anymore, trying to identify alternative revenue streams to repairs, which has always been the profitable side of the business. They sell cars at cost, try to make money in repairs. You can have a car for 3, 4, 5 years today without having a warranty claim on it. The quality has gotten so darn good. So the dealership role in this is clearly transforming as well, which is what you're saying.
Let's come back to that, because I absolutely want to get to the business model. But Michael, thoughts on technology?
Yeah, I just echo what Vivek said. I mean, I think the challenge is that that safety barrier there, and what can you do? I mean, we can, if a car is stationary, we can do a lot to make it emulate everything else we know. In fact, it's going to get worse now that the airlines are starting to ease the restrictions of what you can do in an airline. You know, and say, hey, if I can do this on a plane, why can't I do this on my car? But we've done a lot of work around, for example, allowing and enabling hot lanes where people come in and go out and dynamic pricing. The thing that challenges us is how do we communicate that to the driver and still stay within that safety zone. So I think that last frontier is not just moving these technologies to the car, to the automobile, but moving them in alternate interfaces so that it's you maintain that high level of safety. I mean, I find myself now absentmindedly issuing commands in my car as if I'm on an iPad, and I realize that I'm in a different environment. But every other screen operates the same way, so why should that screen operate differently?
Sure. And maybe if I move to Prasad, right, I'll pick up on a couple of things, not wanting to poke things too much, but right, your understanding of the consumer. Right, you're on the advanced side of things. What are you doing to really understand the consumer and get to a point where you have kind of a common interface that people are used to?
Yeah, I think we certainly are observing the world, like all of us are, and one of the fascinating things that's happened over the last 10 years has been the democratization of innovation. So it's not just we who observe, but almost anyone has the tools now to observe, and not just observe, but to actually build some value proposition around that observation and then participate in a collective creation of value. And so that's what we are embarking on really trying to look at, if you will, the crowds, but also smaller groups of folks who can actually have these probes in smaller contexts, whether it's an urban context in a city, or whether it's someone who's trying to fix their car on their own and upload software or download something that needs to be done to get them on the road again. And so it's really, there's new ecosystems that are coming out of existing dots, whether it's the dealerships that are thinking through what they're going to be doing in the future, or really new dots appearing and new ways in which these dots are getting connected. And so I think there's just a whole way by which we're coming to learn what consumers want and really how we can provide value back to them.
Yep.
There's a couple of examples. One, might seem mundane, the poor old wiper blade that goes left and right, swish, swish, and all of us have sung to 2-year-olds and little kids about how buses go, and school buses in particular. But now if you have 10 sets of wiper blades activated, that's some really useful piece of information for the person 1 or 2 miles behind on the same road. And that's sort of a collective, if you will, crowdsourcing of a electromechanical activity there. But that's a piece of intelligence that we can garner, harness, semantically label and usefully present as a value proposition.
Yep.
Likewise, in the context of health and wellness, and if someone has a pollen allergy and you are able to issue that alert by matching up data that exists on the web at 0 miles per hour, it's something that you can't look up when you're driving at 70 miles an hour. If you have the right kind of presentation mechanism for you that issues an alert and gives you a choice of route based on your pre-stated allergens or your preferences to certain kinds of pollen content, you can then take different ways back home and yet come back feeling fresher and come back feeling good and certainly back home safe.
Good.
So I think there's mechanisms of blending.
If I may,
all this.
Susan, you had a comment, but so just hold the thought a second and let me just pose a second question or another question. So it costs us obviously something to be mobile today. Does the cost of mobility to the consumer go up or go down in the future, and why?
I think cost goes up, but convenience also goes up. And I think that what history has shown is that people will pay for convenience. So I think, and that's the salvation of the car companies, that's the salvation of the dealers. So I think you're going to pay for this convenience, but people will buy that convenience.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say another way to think about it would be maybe cost goes down depending on how you're measuring it, right? So I make poor decisions today because I have bad data or no data, right? So for example, when you're talking about getting on the train, I'm much more likely if I know on a real-time basis my friend is driving down the highway by my house and we're going to the same place, to be able to say, hey, can you just pick me up? Or why don't we carpool together? Or why don't we use these bimodal transportation routes? And I think that's going to be a fundamental shift in terms of the cost equation.
And then if you come back to the connected vehicle, it's like, okay, a $21,000 car cost about $40,000 over the first 5 years of its use for everything that you use, but you only use it 10% of the time. So if you can have a connected vehicle and you only need a car 10% of the time, it really enables the zip car concept of calling up the car, come to your door, take me from A to B, and I'm done with it, and you release the car. And you don't have to go downtown to go look for a zip car or something like that. So this technology could enable, and that could reduce the cost to a consumer.
And what if you could look at cars and treat them as platforms, very much like software? What about the ad revenue of a captive audience that's sitting in a car? You could fundamentally change the business model and the economics.
I don't want to watch ads every day in a car, but there will be a way to make that work, I'm sure. Yeah.
But that raises an interesting point about the intersection of commercial entities and partnerships. So I would, when I'm driving into the city, I would love to know who's having a parking special that day, or who, I drove into Manhattan yesterday or the day before, and I can't keep track. This has a special from 8, if you come in between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. This is 7:30 to 8 a.m., and this one is before 11. And so having that interface, and whether I'm driving past and Starbucks is having a sale or whatever, but bringing those other partners into the vehicle. You spend so much time in the vehicle, and we're looking for bargains, we're looking for parking, we're looking for coffee, and we can get that now, but it's awkward. We have to pull out our phone, we have to fumble with it. That seamless interface, which requires joint partnerships between the manufacturers, between the third-party data providers, and between the private sector.
Absolutely. Susan?
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of that stuff because I think we have the potential for costs to be more accurately reflecting what we're doing and accurately reflecting what we're costing in general. So what we're costing ourselves and society. So on our own side, when you buy a car and then you put gas in, then you kind of are thinking that the gas is free. Like once you've put the gas in, you're just driving anywhere. You don't really think about it. You don't whereas if you have your iPhone or mobile phone, and for everything that you do, you're on the bus, you reserve the car share vehicle, and then you get off the bus at a new mobility hub, you get into the car share, you've swiped the iPhone over, and then you get you get to the train station, you swipe it again, and each interaction is costed out. And that also has the potential to send messages to what is going to be more cost-effective or more environmentally friendly for society. So there are many more sort of accurate and granular opportunities. And on a sort of a slightly wider scale, I think what you were saying, Vivek, about how it affects the larger picture. If these kinds of systems allow us to live in places that have all of these amenities and more easily get around, then we don't actually have to own a car. So that reduces the cost a lot. But it's still good for the car industry because the car industry still has to supply the cars that are in the system. So I think it has some, I don't see it so much grandly going up or down as much as being much more accurate.
I think so. I think all extremely valid points, right? And there is if you think about it, there's an infrastructure. If their infrastructure is going to be updated, that needs to be paid for, right? Again, if there's less fuel being used, then there's some taxes that need to be recouped, right? Again, to plow back into the road. So I think quite a complex equation. And speaking of the business equation, right? There is a business equation that goes along with it with the $8.25 trillion that I talked about in 2010 in moving people and goods. What does that business model look like in the future? And right, the killer question I think is who wins, right? Because you've got a a very different environment, right? You've got this coming together. I was just taking notes as we were talking, right? Where you've got the design of the vehicle being very different, right? You can imagine this small, easy to maneuver, needs to be easily parked, certainly in the urban setting, right? As we move more and more towards that, as Susan talked about. You've got this again, onslaught of electrification, right? For cleaner vehicles, at least at the tailpipe. Right? The source of the energy is obviously key, and that needs to be cleaner too. So it needs to be charged at any point, right, within that setting. And then you've got the third piece, which is the connectivity, right? It needs to be connected to the city or to the other modes of transport. So in that world where you've got smaller vehicles, which traditionally haven't been big winners in terms of profitability in an auto industry, right? It's highly electrified, again, different sources of energy, so macroeconomics changes, the demand for oil changes, and then this connectivity with, again, many links. You again, Susan, you talk about many links. What does the business equation look like? Who wins, right, in that future state? Susan, you want to go?
Yeah, I was thinking about, when I think who wins, I think, well, first of all, what are the general benefits? And for me, the economic benefits are not, just for the individual or just for the big auto company. In general, sustainable transportation, if optimized, should really save money, right? So we've got a kind of a conservation side. So that's one economic benefit. Another one is it should create jobs. It should offer the opportunity for more service jobs. There are a lot of kind of connections in this more complex systems. So, and I think actually that's probably a better kind of a job than maybe a short-term construction gig, which is counted into all the job counts, but maybe not as fulfilling as being able to be a sort of a transportation expert or in that service. And also the high-tech side, there's a lot of high-tech possibility for job creation in this field. And then, of course, the emerging industry, from the point of view of how are car companies like Ford and Toyota rethinking themselves? Bill Ford often talks about sort of thinking of it as a transportation company rather than a car company. And how are the smaller entrepreneurs actually getting into transportation in a way that's beyond the darned old battery? And I love the battery thing, but there are so many more things than that for really smart entrepreneurs. There are the iPhone apps we've been talking about, and then there are the small services that connect the dots between the different sort of public infrastructures. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that everybody wins, because if we're creating a system that serves an economically vital, very livable city, people are going to want to live there, or even a region, not just the city. People are going to want to live there. They're going to be able to get around because it's affordable. More people are going to be able to do it. It's not a matter of you can get around because if you can afford a car, but you're stuck if you can't. There's kind of greater access for everybody. So I see, again, like the costs, like the kind of triggers of measuring the costs, I think the actual benefits are going to spread across if we actually deliver the systems that we need to.
Okay. Let me just move along, because Prasad, if you had to pick a winner as opposed to everybody wins, right, which is wonderful.
I can never pick winners, sorry.
Okay, but if somebody wins, right, again, as an incumbent, you've got a tremendous know-how of how these things are used, right, vehicles are used, but there is, to Susan's point, there's a much bigger pie. Right? Again, is it the incumbent that wins? Is it newcomers that win, or at least take the lead here?
Well, maybe at the risk of sounding slightly different here, I'd say there's going to be some big losers. We just don't know who they are. I mean, they just have to be. Every 5 years we notice this. Every 10 years we certainly see this, and there's enough examples if we just dial back 5 years or 10 years. And so I think, what would happen is if you take the $40,000 number that J.K. mentioned, and you look at the asset utilization, you say it's 10%, and therefore it's $4,000 of value you're getting for that $40,000 cost of ownership. I'd say it's much less than that today if you factor in congestion, because you're just not moving. So if you're moving at a tenth of the posted speed, then it's a $400 value proposition that you're getting, not a $4,000 value proposition. So it's really, who gets the rest of the $39,600? There's an opportunity that's up for grabs, really. Whether it's services, or whether it's the car makers, or whether it's the folks yet to be identified right now. But I think that is really a prime opportunity There's $39,600 waiting per car. Multiply that by the number of billions of cars coming ahead of us, and that's the opportunity.
Huge opportunity. Michael?
I agree with Prasad. I think I think the winners are we don't see them yet. I mean, I think it's going to be a whole cottage industry, to take advantage of ride sharing, car sharing, which is different than ride sharing, asset sharing, purchasing as a cooperative, and I think there's going to be an influx of providers at the intersection of data handling and social media. I think that's going to take advantage of this.
Okay, cool. Vivek?
So I think we clearly know who the losers are going to be, right? Because they're doing exactly what they've been doing since the 1900s. In terms of the winners, I think what you're seeing is a set of companies that are approaching this with a beginner's mind, right? That they're coming at this with a completely new way of thinking about mobility. So you look at the autonomous vehicles, right? It's interesting that a company like Google is sort of investing extremely heavily in that. But that's also being done against a backdrop of what I think is very interesting in terms of not having mobility at all, right? So if you look at a country like Australia, they're investing $37 billion in running fiber to every single household, to 20 million people. So a country like Australia now has the ability to fundamentally reinvent what healthcare looks like and how you deliver healthcare through telemedicine, how education looks like. You no longer need to come to a classroom to get educated. You could deliver it through this fiber infrastructure. So I think that if I had to pick a company or a set of companies, I would say it's the companies that are, one, coming at it with a beginner's mind. Two, we've already seen this movie play out in other industries, like Amazon versus Borders, right? Where you've kind of seen a beginner come in and say, there's a different model, there's a new model, we need to fundamentally hit the reset switch and disrupt the status quo.
Okay, good. And for somebody based in Ann Arbor, Jay, the Borders example was a good one. So winners and losers?
Well, I would just mention that, one scenario is cars are becoming somewhat commoditized. It's a backbone, it's a vehicle to move from A to B, but you're not buying a car because it's got a bigger engine than the other car. It's a mode of transportation. And if that's the case, then the value created by the auto company to make that pod that goes from A to B, the value added is going down over what cars have traditionally been. So that's going to open up new value on the electronic side in terms of the information management, the apps, all these various services that support the system. And auto companies obviously would wisely start migrating into that field. They obviously have to deal with HMI, the human-machine interface, and all those things. But that's going to become standardized, somewhat standardized across the industry. That's not a differentiator. But when you start talking about the use of these vehicles and all of the wonderful things that we just talked about in terms of cities and traffic management and all that stuff, the companies that learn to take advantage of that and move at the rate of electronic and digital advancements is where the money is going to be made. And the auto companies are not done. They're going to move into that field somewhat as well and try to protect some of that. So I think it'll be a dynamic undertaking.
I want to open it up to the audience now and see if we've got questions. I can't quite see where the mic is. Over to this side. But if we have a question, please. Yep. Yep, you're on.
Hi, Adrian Pittman with Detroit Creative Corridor and Module. The question is really to the entire board. Of course, the discussion with mobility and transportation often steers more towards the automotive, but obviously multimodal, as was brought out at the very beginning, is an important part of that growth. A lot of the data that is being disseminated along the mobility route that has to do with things like couponing and other value-added propositions, it's privatized largely, so it's very limited in its scope. The question is, how do you feel about the community, for instance, the city of Detroit or the state of Michigan's involvement in creating a centralized location for that data so that these platforms could be more useful to the audience?
Yeah, I'm not sure that is a municipal responsibility. Someone has to do it. I think that there are other ways that the city of Detroit, I think, can play a more central role. For example, I'm working with a few cities who are focused on putting forward this vision and tying it into parking. Okay? And essentially what they want to do is that they want to capture this information. So there are all of these entities, information entities that the city controls, whether it's on roads, on projects, on status of subway trains or buses or everything else. Okay? And they want to provide that information in a sandbox and use it as a germinator for other for-profit entities to build miles, whether it's insurance companies doing mileage-based insurance, whether they're app developers adding value. So they want to aggregate and disseminate the information that they control, and then through economic development attract other third parties to play in their sandbox. So that's probably, as opposed to them going out and collecting information from the various parking companies, that they want to create this standardization, this model, this data model, and then create this sandbox to germinate opportunities.
I think what the city of Detroit could do, one is begin with itself, right? Democratizing all the data and the asset that it owns, as you mentioned. Second, put in a legislative framework mandate wherever there's government money that's spent, that data will be made public, that it will be open, and you'll have open APIs so that third parties could develop applications and create the level of application that most people need. I mean, think about it today. If you wanted to get on a bus, it's literally like going in your car and sitting for 15 minutes before the engine starts. You actually wouldn't want to go in the car, right? And that's kind of how bus routes work today. And cities around the country haven't done that. They just haven't taken a simple step, such as democratizing this data and allowing third parties, as you mentioned, to innovate and build some of the most innovative apps that most consumers are actually demanding today.
Okay. One quick one, Susan, and then we'll move to the next question.
Okay, I couldn't agree more, and I think this really calls into question how does policy have to change to support the speed of innovation and also the community capacities, because I've been hearing, having just found out that in China a lot of the maps are not actually as accurate as they could be because of that relationship of public information. Mm-hmm. And yet the new technologies can allow that. If our policies can provide a framework rather than be really specific policies that lay out sort of all the rules and regulations, it takes so long to make those policies and to pass them. And by the time they've been laid out and passed, we're on another technology. So we have to really rethink how we provide frameworks with sets of guidelines and principles and open API, open source type of policies that really support interoperability.
Okay, wonderful. Please, next question.
Alan Bateau, Wayne State University. We've been talking overwhelmingly about automobiles. There were a couple of mentions of bicycles, and I think trains were mentioned once. And maybe this is because we're in Detroit, but can we not imagine that other modes as well figure into the evolution of mobility, or are they going to just be adjuncts to the car?
I thought I'd start off by saying that non-motorized mobility has been around with us for 150,000 years, and it's going to be with us for the foreseeable future. We have to be compatible with that and really grow together with that. There's absolutely no way without doing that.
Yeah, the way we define urban mobility is anything that moves, that gets you around. And so in New York City, New York City just announced the bike share program, following Paris's lead and a few other cities across the smaller cities across the country. So it is truly, our definition of effective urban mobility is taking advantage of all of the different modalities of transportation that are available in a city.
Okay, good. Please.
So I have two quick questions that are related. The first is if this information revolution comes about in new automobiles, how do you gather similar data from non-linked automobiles? Like how do you retrofit them to fit into whatever comes? Because regardless of which technology wins, you're going to have that sunk cost, which is going to be 99% of the infrastructure for the foreseeable future. So how, number one, do you gather data from cars? Is there an opportunity to input like third-party systems into existing infrastructure? And then also, how on a systemic level could you retrofit these old cars that are going to be the reality for at least the next 20 years, if not longer?
Okay, Prasad?
Yeah, I think this is it's a really good question. In the United States, it takes about 15 years for about 95% of our vehicles to be replaced. If you come back now in the year 2027, you'll still find about 5% of vehicles that you see on the roads today, but 95% of them would have been replaced. It takes a long time to replace that investment. And so, and the number applies more or less in the same way, maybe it's 20 years in other markets. So what we certainly have to do is to create the toolkits that enable the safe extension of existing vehicles, whether they're platforms built into the vehicles, or platforms that are at 0 miles an hour out in a service station in the back, or or on the road. And so really what we're going to see are the evolution of these enablers for innovation at the grassroots, in the hands of the third-party developers. You're kind of seeing this in the world of phones today. iPhones and Android platforms are sort of the buzz platforms today, but you'll increasingly start seeing this in the form of hardware additions and software that comes onto all kinds of other solutions associated with personal transportation.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Is it the phone that needs to change or the car that needs to change?
Well, I think it's both, right? The consumer is changing, and so they're going to ask for it.
On the consumer, is it all right if I say just something? We're doing this study on how consumers are changing, and part of it is that we make consumers be a certain type of consumer up until now. So a lot of the research on transportation is what's better, buses or cars or bicycles, and it becomes a food fight across modes. And it becomes something that means, it's sort of, I have this story about how, or I imagine a story of how if God were to say, do you want a heart or a lung or a pituitary gland? And you'd say, I want all of them and I want them to work together. But it's so difficult to understand how people choose a system of stuff, like a portfolio of things, versus one mode. So how could you either get out of your car or move towards a whole system of things? So this work that we're doing is looking at the consumer from that point of view, that they're doing many different trade-offs. And I think once we start doing work that looks at the consumer that way, it will continually allow the consumer to be more that way and continually allow us to produce more things that suit those needs, those multiple needs.
Right. Wonderful. Last question, please.
So one of the really exciting things about this conference is talking about how technology is enabling all kinds of new solutions, and talking about big data, digital technology. And when you think about it in the context of mobility, it's bringing together vehicle OEMs, infrastructure, electronics companies. They're not necessarily stakeholders who have a strong history of working together. So when you think about the sophisticated technologies or products and services that will need to be developed in order to bring these concepts into a marketplace, what needs to happen to bring all of these diverse stakeholders together? And are there new mechanisms for collaboration that need to evolve and be structured? And who are the right people to create those mechanisms?
Yeah. So let me just preface it, because we've got literally 1 minute left, so we can have 10 seconds each. So my answer is yes, we do need new models. Jay?
Well, the auto company owns the car today and owns the real estate inside the car. And they are going to be looking for partnerships and relationships to bring people in to work on that together. So I think at least at the onset, it's going to be the auto companies looking for partnerships and bringing in the players. And that may evolve or change over time, but initially I see that as being the model.
Prasad? Oh, Vivek, sorry.
I think the market forces are already well underway to make that happen. And secondly, I would say that this notion of a beginner's mind and companies that are looking for the more innovative path is what's driving them because of the educated consumer.
Michael?
You have examples in other industries of this collaboration. If you look at intelligent buildings and the collaboration between companies like IBM and Cisco and Siemens and Johnson Controls. So the precedent is there.
Yeah, we've been building cars for 109 years, and we're proud to be building great cars, but we certainly recognize that our future is more than just building cars, so we're looking for collaborations.
And what a beautiful question, because much of the work that SMART does at the University of Michigan is to, until this coalesces, to act as a link tank in cities in India, South Africa, Brazil, and the Philippines to bring together private sector, both small entrepreneurs and big businesses, academic institutions, all levels of government and NGOs to map out the grid and to together work on not only how to make the transportation system improve, but how to develop economic opportunities around it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the question. Thank you very much to the panel.